Welcome to Grandpa Explains. Settle in. Pull the blanket up a little higher, if you like. There's nothing to figure out tonight, nothing to remember in the morning, nowhere else you need to be. You don't need to know anything about psychology or old books or Swiss doctors to follow along. You only need to let the words move slowly past you like water under a bridge, while the rest of you grows heavy and soft. Wherever you are, whatever time it is where you're listening from, let yourself sink a little deeper into the place where you're lying. I'll do the talking, you just rest. So, let me start with something small and strange, the kind of thing you might hold in your hand. Imagine a crystal. Picture one of those clear stones a child might find on a shelf or in a shop window. 6 neat sides and a point at the top. The kind that catches the light and throws little rainbows on the wall. Now I want you to picture the moment before that crystal exists. Picture a glass of water, perfectly still, with a certain mineral dissolved into it. You can't see anything yet. The water looks ordinary, clear, nothing in it but more water. And then slowly, as the conditions change, something begins to happen. The mineral starts to gather itself out of the water. It begins to form a solid shape, and here is the curious part, the part I want you to hold gently as you drift. That shape is not random. It will always come out the same way, the same angles, the same number of sides, the same geometry every single time, whether it forms in a laboratory in Switzerland or in a cave deep under a mountain that no human eye has ever seen. Why does it always take the same shape? Because there is a pattern hidden inside the substance itself, an invisible scaffolding. The scientists call it the axial system, the inner lattice, a kind of secret blueprint built right into the nature of the thing. You cannot see this blueprint, you cannot weigh it or hold it. Before the crystal forms, the blueprint has no body of its own at all. It is not a crystal. It is not even a tiny crystal. It is only the law, the tendency, the readiness to become a crystal in a particular shape the moment the conditions are right. Now, here is the thought that one man held up to the light almost 100 years ago, and it changed the way a great many people understood themselves. He said the human mind has something like that lattice in it too, an invisible inner scaffolding, a set of patterns that shape what grows in us, the way the lattice shapes the crystal, without our ever seeing the pattern itself. His name was Carl Gustav Jung, and we'll get to know him properly in a little while. But first I want to clear away a misunderstanding, because almost everyone gets this part wrong. And you may have heard the wrong version yourself. People say that Jung believed we inherit memories, that somewhere deep down we carry the actual experiences of our great-great-grandparents, like old photographs tucked in the back of a drawer in the mind, that a fear of snakes is really the memory of some ancestor who was bitten long ago, passed down through the blood. It's a tidy idea, it's a comforting idea in its way. And it is not what he said. That's the part worth slowing down for, because the truth he pointed at is stranger and I think more beautiful. He did not say we inherit the memory. He said we inherit the lattice, not the crystal, but the shape the crystal is bound to take. Not the picture, but the empty channel the picture will one day flow through. Think of it this way. Picture a riverbed, dry, carved into the land long before any rain has fallen this year. The riverbed is not water. It holds no water yet, but it has a shape, and that shape decides exactly where the water will run the moment the rain comes. We are born, he said, with riverbeds already carved into us, empty, waiting. We are not born with the water. The water is our own life, our own experience, the people we meet and the stories we're told, and the things that frighten us and the things we love. That water is ours alone. but it runs in channels that were carved long before we arrived. He had a word for those riverbeds, those crystal lattices of the soul. He called them archetypes. And we are going to spend our quiet hours tonight walking among them, slowly, one by one, the way you'd walk through a great old house, room by room, by candlelight, in no hurry at all. But before the names, before the cast of figures that live inside every one of us, I want to tell you the story that first made a young doctor suspect that something like this was true, because he didn't dream it up in a comfortable chair. It came to him out of the strangest of places. It came to him from a man in a hospital ward, a man who most of the world had given up on, who said something that should not have been possible. Let me tell you about that man. We don't know his name. The records simply remember him as a patient at a hospital called the Burghölzli in Zurich, where the young doctor worked in the early years of the last century, around 1906. The Burghölzli was a place for people whose minds had come apart, in the way minds sometimes do, where the inner world floods out and washes over the ordinary one until a person can no longer tell which is which. And this particular man was lost in just such a flood. He stood at the window much of the day. He had visions, the kind that to him were as solid and certain as the floor under his feet. One day he called the young doctor over to the window. He wanted to show him something. He told him to half close his eyes against the bright sun and to look carefully. "Do you see it?" he asked. "Do you see the sun's tube?" The doctor did not understand. "The tube," the man insisted. "The sun has a tube hanging from it, a great hanging pipe swinging down from the sun toward the earth." And here was the heart of it, the detail the man was so certain of. When the sun's tube swings from side to side, he said, that is where the wind comes from. The wind is born from the moving of the tube. "Move your head a little," he said, "and you'll see it sway. And as it sways, feel the wind change. Now, put yourself for a moment in that quiet hospital room, a man, unwell, speaking with total conviction about a hanging pipe on the sun that no one else can see, and naming it as the secret machinery behind the wind. To the doctors of the day, this was simply the broken talk of a broken mind, beautiful perhaps in its strange way, but meaningless, a symptom, nothing more, and so it was written down and very nearly forgotten. But it was not forgotten by the young doctor because something about it stayed with him, the way a single odd phrase sometimes lodges in your own mind and won't leave. He filed it away. He went on with his life and his work. Years passed, about 4 years in fact. And then around 1910 he came across something that made the hair on his arms stand up. He was reading a newly published old text, an ancient one, a piece of religious writing from a world long dead, from the worshippers of a god called Mithras, a faith that had flourished and faded back in the days of the Roman legions, almost 2,000 years before. The text had only recently been brought to light and printed by a scholar, and so it sat in a book that had been on no shelf the man in the hospital could ever have reached. This Mithraic writing, this old liturgy, described a vision, a way of seeing the hidden workings of the cosmos, and in it, plain as anything, it spoke of a tube hanging down from the disk of the sun, and it said that from this tube came the wind, and that as the tube turned toward different regions, the wind would blow from there. Let that settle for a moment, slowly, in the dark. A man locked in a hospital who could not have read this text, who almost certainly could not read such things at all, had described detail for detail the same impossible image that an unknown believer had carved into words nearly 2,000 years before he was born. The hanging tube on the sun. The wind born from its moving. The same vision rising in two minds, separated by 20 centuries, and by everything else as well, with no possible thread of teaching or memory or book to connect them. The young doctor did not think this was magic. He was a careful man, a scientific man, and he wanted no part of fairy tales. But he could not explain it away either. The man could not have learned the image, so where did it come from? It had to have come from somewhere inside him that was not built out of his own life and his own learning. Somewhere deeper, somewhere perhaps that all of us carry, and that now and then, in dreams, in fevers, in the unguarded mind, opens up and lets an old image float to the surface. An image that does not belong to one person at all, but to all of us at once. I should be honest with you here, the way a grandfather ought to be. Scholars who came later have argued about this story. They've questioned the exact dates, whether the timing was quite as clean as it was later told, whether the man might somehow have come across the idea another way. It's right to hold it gently rather than grip it too hard. But the doctor himself never doubted what it pointed to, and it became one of the seeds, one of the first strange seeds, of everything that grew afterward. So we'll keep it. We'll set it on the shelf beside our crystal, two small, strange things to turn over as the night goes on. A pattern that forces a shape it cannot be seen to hold, and an image that surfaced in two minds 2,000 years apart, as if both had drawn from the same hidden well. Now let me tell you a little about the man who could not let these things go. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 in Switzerland, a country of mountains and cold, clear lakes and long, quiet winters, the kind of place that gives a person plenty of room to think. He lived a long life, all the way to 1961, more than 80 years, and in that time he became one of the great explorers of the inner world, though he never left dry land to do it. He trained as a psychiatrist, a doctor of the mind, in the days when that science was very young and most of its maps were still mostly blank. In those early years he fell into the orbit of an older, famous man, a man whose name you've almost certainly heard, Sigmund Freud. Freud was the great pioneer of the time, the one who had insisted against a great deal of resistance that beneath the part of us we know, the part that thinks and plans and remembers, there lies a vast hidden region we do not know at all. The unconscious, he called it. A cellar under the house of the mind, full of things we've pushed down out of sight, old wishes and old wounds, the things we'd rather not look at. For a time, Jung was Freud's brightest follower, almost a chosen son. The older man hoped Jung would carry the work forward after he was gone. But it didn't last. Around 1912 and 1913, the two men broke apart, and it was not a gentle parting. They came to disagree about the deepest things, about the very nature of that hidden cellar under the mind. For Freud, the cellar was mostly personal. It was your cellar, full of your own buried things. But Jung had begun to suspect, partly because of stories like the man and the sun's tube, that beneath your private cellar there was something deeper still. A floor below the floor, a region that was not yours at all, but everyone's. And Freud would not follow him there, so they parted. And it cost Jung dearly. He went through a long, hard, lonely stretch after that, a kind of inner storm where he had to find his own footing without the older man's blessing or the comfort of the circle he'd belonged to. Out of that struggle, slowly, he built his own way of understanding the mind, and he gave it a name to set it apart. He called it analytical psychology, and it's from that work, gathered over a lifetime into volume after volume of his collected writings, that everything we'll talk about tonight comes down to us. Now here is the heart of what he came to believe, and I'll lay it out as gently as I can because it's the doorway to all the rooms we'll visit later. Jung said there are, in a manner of speaking, two cellars beneath the lit house of the mind, not one. The first he called the personal unconscious. This is your cellar, and yours alone. It's filled with the things that belong to your own life, the memories you've forgotten, the feelings you pushed down because they were too much to carry at the time, the small humiliations, the old loves, the things you decided not to look at. Every person's personal cellar is different because every person's life is different. If you and I went down into our personal cellars, we'd find entirely different things down there, the leftovers of two entirely different lives. But beneath that personal cellar, Jung said, there is a deeper one, and this one is not yours. It is not mine. It belongs to no single person, and so strangely, it belongs to all of us at once. He called it the collective unconscious. He wrote about it most fully in a book whose title says plainly what it's about, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, which appeared in its full form in 1959, near the end of his long life, though he'd been circling the idea for decades. The collective unconscious is the floor below the floor. And here is the thing that makes it so different from the personal cellar above it. It is not filled with memories at all. Remember the riverbeds, remember the crystal's lattice. The deepest layer of the mind, Jung said, is not stocked with old pictures and old experiences. It is shaped by patterns, by forms, by those carved empty channels we're all born with, the same in you as in me, the same in a child born tonight as in a child born 10,000 years ago. We do not inherit our grandparents' memories. We could not. The memories died with them. What we inherit is the shape, the readiness, the way the mind is built to organize the flood of living into certain recognizable figures and stories. And those inherited shapes, those riverbeds of the soul, are the archetypes. I want to come back to that one more time, slowly, because it is the single thing most worth carrying out of tonight if you carry anything at all. And you don't need to. You can let it all wash away by morning. But if one piece stays, let it be this. An archetype is not a picture. It is the tendency to make a certain kind of picture. It is not a story. It is the readiness to fall into a certain kind of story. It is not the wise old man with the white beard you might see in a dream. It is the empty riverbed down which the figure of the wise old man comes flowing in your dream and in mine, and in a fairy tale told by a fire 1,000 years ago, each time wearing slightly different clothes, but always underneath the same shape of thing. And this leads to one more distinction Jung drew, the last one I'll set down before we rest a moment, and it's a clean and useful one. He spoke about it in his writings on the nature of the psyche, the nature of the soul. He said we have to keep two things separate in our minds. There is on one hand what he called the archetype as such. This is the pure form, the riverbed itself, the crystal's invisible lattice. And this thing, he said, we can never actually see. Not directly. It's like trying to see the shape of the wind. You can only ever see what the wind moves, the bending grass, the swaying branch, never the wind itself. The archetype as such is unknowable in the same way. It has no picture of its own. It's the pattern behind all the pictures, and it stays forever just out of sight, like the law that shapes the crystal, but is not itself a crystal you can hold. And then on the other hand, there is what he called the archetypal image. And this we can see. This is everywhere. This is the form, once it has been filled with the water of a particular time and place and people. This is the riverbed, once the rain has come and the river is running, and you can finally see where the water goes. Let me make that simple, the way I'd make it simple for a grandchild who'd half drifted off. Think of the great mother figure, the deep, ancient sense of the mother as a vast power, both tender and terrible. That deep sense is the form, the archetype as such. The riverbed, you can't point to it directly, but every people on earth has filled that riverbed with their own water and given the figure their own face and their own name. In old Egypt, she wore the face of the goddess Isis. In Greece, she became Demeter, the great grain mother of the harvest. In India, she took the fierce and astonishing form of Kali. And in the Christian world, she became the gentle virgin, the Madonna, with the child in her arms. 4 faces, 4 names, 4 costumes, you might say. But underneath all of them, Jung said, the same shape, the same riverbed, the same archetype as such, running quietly beneath the surface of every one. The form is universal, the costume is local. That's the whole of it, really, said in a single breath. We are all working from the same handful of invisible patterns, but each people, each age, each dreamer dresses those patterns in the clothes nearest to hand. A Greek dreams a Greek god, a Christian dreams a saint. A child today might dream a figure from a film. The face changes with the century, the shape beneath does not. And so you can begin to see, can't you, even half asleep, why the title of tonight's long, quiet walk is what it is. The archetypes that live inside everyone. Not the archetypes of the ancients out there in their crumbling temples. Not the archetypes of one tribe or one faith. The ones inside you right now in the dark as you lie there breathing slowly. The same riverbeds run through you that ran through the man at the hospital window and through the worshipper of Mithras 2,000 years before him, and through whoever first dreamed of a great mother by a fire we will never find the ashes of. Let's pause here for a moment together. There's no hurry at all. Take a slow, deep breath if you'd like to in through the nose and let it out long and easy. Notice how heavy your body has become against the bed. Notice the small sounds of the room and how far away they seem now. You don't have to hold on to a single word I've said. The crystal and its lattice, the man and the sun's tube, the riverbeds carved before we were born. Let them all float there, just out of reach, like things seen through half-closed eyes. They'll keep. We have all night. When you're ready, and there's no need to be ready before you are, we'll go on, because we've only stood at the doorway so far. We've talked about the lattice and the riverbed, about the floor below the floor, about the forms we all carry and the costumes each of us dresses them in. But we haven't yet met the figures themselves, the cast of characters who live in those deep rooms of the mind, and there's quite a crowd of them, each one a face you'll half recognize because you've met them all before, in stories, in dreams, in the people around you and in yourself, though you may never have known their names. There is a figure Jung called the shadow, the part of us we'd rather not admit to, the one who carries everything we've pushed down and refused to be. There is a thing he called the persona, named for the mask that the old actors wore upon the stage, the face we show the world that is never quite the whole of us. There is the inner figure of the opposite, the one Jung called the anima in a man and the animus in a woman, the hidden other half that walks quietly inside each of us. There is the great mother in both her faces, the one who gives life and the one who takes it back, the womb and the tomb in a single figure. There is the wise old man who waits at the edge of every story to hand the hero the one thing he needs. There is the trickster, that sly, laughing, trouble-making spirit who turns up, astonishingly, on continent after continent, under a different name each time, with the same grin underneath. There is the hero himself, whose life, it turns out, follows a pattern so exact that you can almost check it off on a list. There is the divine child, the small and shining one, born in danger, carrying the future. And there is the maiden, the young one who goes down into the dark and comes back changed. We'll meet them all slowly, one at a time, the way you'd be introduced to the people at a long, gentle gathering where no one is in any rush to leave. And at the very end of our walk, in the deepest room of the house, we'll find the one Jung thought was the most important of all, the center of the whole circle. The figure he was almost afraid to name plainly, but did anyway, calling it nothing less than the God within us. But that one is for much later, when the night is older and you are deeper into sleep, and we will come to it gently, the way you come to the most precious thing in a house last of all, after you've passed through every other room. For now, just rest with the shape of it. The lattice and the river. The two cellars, the personal and the collective. The form and the costume. The doctor at the window listening to a man describe the impossible and feeling the floor of his own certainty shift beneath him. Everything we'll meet from here grows out of that single, overturned idea that we do not carry memories down the long chain of the generations, but something subtler and, I think, far more wonderful. We carry the shapes, the empty, waiting, ancient shapes. And our whole life long, without ever quite knowing it, we pour ourselves into them. So let your breathing slow a little more. Let the room grow dim around the edges of your mind. We have whole rooms still to wander, whole figures still to meet, and all the time in the world to meet them in. There's nowhere to be but here, and nothing to do but listen and drift as we go on together into the deeper rooms of the house that is, in the end, only ever you. The first of the everyday figures lives closer to the surface than any other. It is not distant or mythic or hard to find. It is the part of you that you would least like anyone else to see. Jung called it the shadow. And that name is exactly right, because a shadow is not a separate thing. It belongs to you. It goes where you go. It is made of the same light that makes you visible. And yet it falls behind you in the direction you are not looking. And it takes the shape of everything you have turned away from in yourself. Let us explore a story about this. Not a historical story, but a teaching one of the kind that makes the idea sit still long enough to be understood. There was once a man who prided himself above almost everything else on being calm. He had worked at it for years. When others raised their voices in arguments, he did not. When colleagues lost their composure in meetings, he held his. His children would say, with a mixture of admiration and something quietly uncomfortable, that their father never lost his temper. He had decided somewhere early in his life that anger was an ugly thing, that it was the mark of a person who had not yet learned to govern themselves, and so he had governed it out, or believed he had. He had filed it away in a room he did not visit. But the anger did not stop existing simply because he had stopped looking at it. It went into the shadow. And the shadow, being underground, being without a name or a face, began to leak out sideways. He found himself deeply, unreasonably irritated by colleagues who were, as he put it to himself, too emotional. He found himself grimly judging acquaintances who could not seem to control themselves. He would say with real conviction that he simply did not understand how people could go around feeling everything so loudly. And when his youngest daughter, at 17, threw a plate across the kitchen in a moment of adolescent fury, his response was so cold and so disproportionate that it stayed between them for years. This is what Jung meant. The shadow is not simply the evil within us, though it can hold that too. It is everything we have decided we are not. The tidiness, we do not allow ourselves the wildness, the laziness, the neediness, the jealousy, the grief. We put all of it somewhere, and the somewhere is the shadow, and the shadow does not forget, and the shadow does not remain still. One of Jung's observations, and one that is both uncomfortable and strangely freeing, is that the shadow contains not only what is genuinely dark, but sometimes things that are genuinely good. A person raised to believe that ambition is selfish may carry their own drive and desire in the shadow. A person taught that tenderness is weakness may store their own warmth there, unreachable, leaking out as a strange and sourceless loneliness. The shadow is not a moral category. It is the repository of the unacknowledged, and here is the thing Jung said that changes everything once you hear it. He said that the contents of the shadow appear to us in projection. That is, we see them outside in other people before we see them inside ourselves. The man who cannot tolerate his own anger sees rage everywhere in others. The woman who cannot allow herself to be vain watches for vanity in the people around her with an almost prosecutorial sharpness. The thing we cannot admit in ourselves becomes the thing we cannot stop noticing in the world. This is where the shadow stops being a psychological curiosity and starts being, quite seriously, one of the main engines of human suffering. Wars have been fought, families split, communities poisoned, all by people absolutely certain that the darkness was out there, in the other person, in the other group, and never for a moment suspecting that they were looking at a very old mirror. Integrating the shadow in Jungian terms does not mean becoming the thing you feared. It does not mean letting the anger out or the wildness loose without restraint. It means meeting it, looking at it, saying with something like honesty, yes, this is in me too. Yes, this belongs to the same person I call myself. And the moment you can do that even a little, the projection starts to lose its power. The thing you feared in the other person becomes less blinding because you no longer need it to be entirely out there. Take a slow, deep breath. Let that sit for a moment, however it sits. And when you are ready, we will continue. Now, just above the shadow, just at the threshold between the inside and the outside world, lives a figure that is almost its opposite in character, and yet just as necessary. Jung called it the persona. The word itself tells the whole story, and Jung chose it deliberately. Persona in Latin is the mask worn by actors in the ancient Greek and Roman theatre. The masks were large, stylized, often equipped with a kind of cone in the mouth to amplify the voice, and they told the audience at a glance who was speaking. The laughing mask, the weeping mask. Comedy and tragedy defined in a single carved expression. You wore the mask was not you. But the character lived in the mask, and without it no performance was possible. That, Jung said, is the social self, the version of you that shows up for the role you are playing. And we all play roles: the professional, the parent, the reliable friend, the competent colleague, the person who handles things, the person who is fine. We build the persona not because we are dishonest, but because society requires it, and because, in truth, it is not possible or even desirable to bring the full weight of your interior life to every interaction. A doctor in a consultation room needs to wear the persona of the doctor, needs to hold a shape that is steady and trustworthy, even on the days when their own life is difficult. A parent needs to hold the shape of the parent, steady and available, even when their own child self is exhausted. The persona is not bad, it is necessary. Where it becomes a problem, Jung said, is when you forget it is a mask. When you become so identified with the role, so merged with the performance, that you genuinely do not know what is underneath. When someone asks you what you really want, and you find that the person who usually answers that question, the competent professional, the reliable one, the one who handles things, does not actually know. That is the persona without a shadow, to balance it. All surface, no depth. A brilliant, polished, functional emptiness. We have a word for people who seem to be only their persona, who appear to have no life underneath the performance. We say there is something not quite there, something missing behind the eyes. And what is missing is precisely the rest of the psyche, the buried rooms, the unacknowledged contents, the things that make a person feel from the inside like a real person and not a very good imitation of one. Let us rest for a moment here. Take a breath. Notice the weight of your own body where it settles against the surface beneath you. There is no mask required here, in the dark, in the quiet. And when you are ready, we will move on to the next figure, which goes deeper still. The anima and the animus. These are the figures Jung described as the inner feminine in a man and the inner masculine in a woman, and they live deeper in the unconscious than either the shadow or the persona. They are not about gender, as we might now define it, not about social roles or cultural expectations in the contemporary sense. They are something older and stranger than that. They are the psyche's own inner other, the part of itself that carries the qualities and capacities that have not been developed in the outer life. A man who has lived, as most men in most historical periods were expected to live, primarily in the qualities associated with the masculine, with assertion and rational structure, and the containment of feeling, will carry the anima, the inner feminine, as a figure in his unconscious. And the anima, being unconscious, being not owned or met or named, will exert her influence sideways, the way all unconscious contents do. She will show up in the man's projections onto women in his outer life. The woman he falls suddenly and irrationally in love with, the woman he puts on a pedestal and then can't understand when she turns out to be human, the woman he fears without knowing why. He is not seeing the woman clearly. He is seeing the anima. He is wearing her face on the person standing in front of him, which is very beautiful and very confusing for everyone involved. The animus in a woman works similarly but differently in character. Jung described him as more collective in his pronouncements, more given to absolute opinions, to certainty delivered without much visible evidence. The woman who hears a voice inside herself saying, "You will never be good enough," or "This is simply how things are," or "It is not worth trying," is often hearing the animus in one of his negative forms, the one Jung called, in his unsentimental way, the death animus, because his function is to pull the woman away from life, from connection, from her own vitality. Both the anima and the animus, like the shadow, can be carriers of something genuinely valuable. The man who befriends his anima, who learns to take his feeling life seriously, who allows the interior feminine to teach him something about relatedness and receptivity and depth, becomes fuller. He becomes more himself, not less. The woman who meets her animus not as a voice of judgment but as an inner capacity for clarity and directed will, who makes him a companion rather than a tyrant, gains something real. She becomes more herself as well. These are, in Jung's framework, the deep companions, the inner partners, and the work of individuation, the long work of becoming who you truly are, involves, among other things, meeting these figures honestly and learning to carry what they bring. But now we go to the great figures, the ones that appear not only in the individual psyche but in the collective life of every human culture that has ever existed, the ones that show up in the myths and the dreams and the temples, wearing different names in every place but carrying the same essential shape. These are the archetypes in their most powerful, most recognizable form, and we begin with perhaps the most ancient of them all, the Great Mother. Breathe in gently. This is a very old figure we are moving toward, and she deserves a certain slowness. There is an image that Erich Neumann, one of Jung's most gifted students, returned to again and again in his great study, The Great Mother, published in 1955. Neumann spent years tracing the figure of the maternal feminine across archaeological finds, across the statues and the painted caves and the temple reliefs of dozens of cultures, across myths from every continent. And what he found was not many different goddesses, but a single archetype wearing many names and many faces. He called the book an analysis of the archetype, not a catalogue of goddesses, because what he was interested in was the underlying form, the shape that kept being generated across vast distances of time and space, and the form he found was always double. The Great Mother gives life. She nourishes, she shelters, she holds. She is the warmth at the center of things, the breast, the hearth, the earth from which the grain grows. Every civilization that has ever grown grain has named and worshipped this. She is Isis in Egypt, the most beloved of all the gods, she who reassembles what has been broken. She is Demeter in Greece, the goddess of the wheat, the one whose grief at her daughter's disappearance makes the earth go barren. She is the Virgin Mary, tender and interceding, standing between the human person and the demands of a too large universe. But she is also Kali. Let us spend a moment with that, because this is where the archetype becomes uncomfortable and important. Kali in Hindu tradition is a goddess of terrifying aspect. She is depicted with a dark face and multiple arms, a necklace of skulls around her neck, a tongue extended, standing on the prostrate body of Shiva. She is the destroyer. She is time and death in their most unsparing form. She is everything that ends, and yet she is also understood by those who know her deeply as a face of the mother, a form of Shakti, the great feminine power of the universe. Why? Why would the mother be the destroyer? Neumann's answer, drawing on Jung, is that this is not a contradiction, but a completeness. The same force that gives life takes it back. The womb and the tomb are the same shape. The earth that grows the grain is the earth that receives the dead. The mother who holds the child in warmth and safety is the same mother, in the largest sense, who will one day hold them in the ground. The archetype is whole, and it holds the whole of the thing it represents, not just the comfortable half. In our ordinary lives, this appears in many forms. A mother who loves her children can also, without knowing it, love them in ways that hold them back, that pull them toward dependence, that swallow rather than free. The nourishing and the devouring are never very far from each other, and the archetype knows this even when the individual does not. Let us explore a story about this. Once, in a village by the sea, there was a woman who was known for her extraordinary generosity. Everyone said it. People came to her in difficulty and she fed them, housed them, gave them advice, gave them money she could not really spare. For years she did this and was loved for it. And then one of the young people she had helped, a girl who had lived in her house for 2 years, met a man from another town and decided to go and make her life there. The woman's response shocked everyone who saw it, including the woman herself. She raged, she grieved, she became ill. She said the girl was ungrateful, that she had given everything and received nothing in return. The girl, bewildered and guilty, almost did not go. What had happened? The woman had been mothering, genuinely and warmly, from a part of herself that had not examined its own needs. The giving had also been a holding. The nourishing had also been a claiming. The Great Mother had been at work in her, and the Great Mother, being an archetype and not a personal possession, carries both faces, and the one that had not been seen came out sideways in anger, in grief, in the accusation of ingratitude. It was not the woman's fault. It was the unmet, unexamined dimension of a very old force. To know this is not to condemn the woman. It is to see her more clearly and to see the archetype at work in her. and to know that meeting the archetype, becoming aware of its double nature, is itself a form of freedom. Take a slow breath. Notice how the room feels. And when you are ready, we continue. Now we come to a figure who stands at a particular kind of doorway, and who is, in the fairy tales and the myths, among the most beloved, the most expected, and in real life, the most longed for. Jung called him the wise old man. He also called this archetype by its Latin name the senex, which simply means the old man, the elder. In the language of Jungian analysis, he is sometimes called the spirit archetype, or the mana personality, mana being a Polynesian word that passed into general usage for a kind of luminous, charged spiritual power. He is the figure who carries wisdom. And the wisdom he carries is not ordinary accumulated knowledge. It is something older and deeper than that. It is the wisdom that comes from having been in the right relationship to the unconscious for a long time, from having made the journey the hero is just beginning. Jung treated him formally in an essay called The Phenomenology of the Spirit in Fairy Tales, which appeared in the Collected Works, Volume 9. But you do not need that essay to recognize this figure. You have already met him. He appears at thresholds. At the moment in the story when the young person has exhausted their own resources, when they have tried everything they know how to try and it has not been enough, the old man appears. Sometimes he seems unpromising. He is often disguised, shabby, easy to dismiss. In the fairy tale tradition, the hero who is generous to the strange old beggar at the crossroads receives the gift. The hero who is proud and passes him by does not. The disguise is the test. Think of Merlin. Not as stage magic, not as a character in a particular film, but as an archetype. The old enchanter who stands behind the young king, who gives advice not entirely in the form of answers, but in the form of challenges, who is sometimes infuriating and sometimes uncanny, and who is always pointing the young one towards something they cannot yet see. The knowledge he carries is not his knowledge in the sense of personal achievement. It is as if he has been given access to something, as if his age and his inwardness have worn away the surface of things and he can see a little of what is underneath. The professors and teachers and grandparents and mentors who have mattered most in your life, if you have been fortunate enough to have them, have carried some of this. There is a kind of teaching that is not information transfer. There is a kind of presence that stops you in the middle of your own confusion and orients you, not by telling you where to go, but by showing you, somehow, that there is somewhere to go, that the confusion is not the last word. The people who have offered you that, even briefly, even once, were carrying the wise old man, or rather, the wise old man was speaking through them. Let us explore a story about this. There was once a young woman studying to become a physician in the 3rd year of her training, which is the year that sits at the threshold between the theory of medicine and the practice of it, the year when real patients begin to appear, and the knowledge in the books begins to meet the knowledge that books cannot hold. She was good at the theory. She had always been good at the theory. But she was frightened of the patients, and specifically frightened of not knowing, of being seen to not know, of the moment when a patient asked a question and she had no answer. She held this fear privately, the way you hold the things you think you should have outgrown. She did not tell her supervisors. She performed competence the way some people perform calm. One afternoon, she was at the bedside of an elderly man with a complicated diagnosis, and he asked her a question about his prognosis that she genuinely could not answer. She felt the familiar fear arriving, cold and quick, and she began to formulate the diplomatic non-answer, the one that sounds like information, but is not. And then the attending physician, an old man who had been standing slightly behind her, who had barely spoken that day, said quietly to the patient, "She doesn't know yet. None of us know yet, but we are paying very close attention." And the patient, to her astonishment, relaxed. He settled back in his bed. He said that was fine, that he'd wondered, that he was glad they were watching. Afterward, in the corridor, she was going to apologize, to explain that she was still learning, and the old physician said, before she could speak, "The most useful sentence in medicine is also the most frightening one to say." And then he walked away. She said later that those two sentences changed her practice more than any textbook, not because they were complicated, but because they arrived at exactly the right threshold, from exactly the right person, at exactly the moment when she was ready to hear them. That is the wise old man, not always kind in the obvious sense, sometimes sharp, sometimes withholding, sometimes appearing only for a moment, but always appearing at the threshold, and always, if you can receive what he is offering, giving you the one thing that changes what comes after. Take a breath. Let that image settle. The threshold. The old man. The gift that is sometimes a challenge in disguise. And now we arrive at one of the great surprises of the archetype catalogue. One of the figures Jung considered with something approaching genuine delight, because this one breaks all the rules, and breaking the rules is, as it turns out, also an ancient and necessary function of the human psyche, the trickster. Let us spend real time with this one, because the trickster is a figure that appears, and this is not metaphor or vague intuition. This is a documented, citable, verifiable cross-cultural fact on 5 separate continents under 5 different names in cultures that had no known contact with one another, carrying the same essential character in every place. Jung wrote a dedicated essay on this figure in 1954. It appeared as a commentary to a remarkable study by an anthropologist named Paul Radin, who had spent years living with and listening to the Winnebago people, a Native American people also known by their own name as the Ho-Chunk in Wisconsin. Radin had gathered their trickster cycle, a long sequence of stories about a figure who is simultaneously a creator and a fool, sacred and obscene, wise and helplessly stupid, and he published it in 1956 under the title The Trickster. Jung and the classical scholar Carl Gustav both contributed commentaries to Radin's study, and what Jung wrote in his commentary was, in effect, that Radin had documented something that was not merely Winnebago and not merely North American. He had documented the trickster archetype in one of its clearest, most unmediated forms. But let us look at who this figure is before we go further, because the word trickster can suggest someone merely clever, someone who cheats or schemes, and the archetype is much larger and stranger than that. In Greece, the trickster wears the name Hermes, and Hermes is already a god of contradictions. He is the messenger of the gods, which means he is the one who crosses between worlds, who moves between the high and the low, between the living and the dead. He guides souls to the underworld. He is also the patron of thieves, of travelers, of crossroads, of commerce, of language, of medicine. The caduceus, the staff entwined by 2 serpents that is still used as a symbol of medicine today, is Hermes' staff. He invented the lyre. He tricked Apollo out of cattle on the day of his birth as an infant, still in his swaddling clothes, and then bargained his way to a place among the Olympians using the lyre he had made from a tortoise shell. He lives at the boundary. He is the one who can pass through the door that everyone else is stopped by. In the Norse tradition, the trickster is Loki, and Loki is, in some ways, the most interesting figure in the entire Norse pantheon, because he is not simply a comic character, he is genuinely dangerous. He is the one who outwits the giants, the one whose cleverness saves the gods again and again, and he is also, in the end, the one whose cleverness undoes them. He arranges the death of Baldur, the most beloved of the gods, through a scheme of almost baroque ingenuity, and it is this act that sets in motion the chain of events that will end in Ragnarok, the destruction of the world. The trickster who saves and the trickster who destroys are the same trickster. He cannot be kept on one side. In North American indigenous traditions, the trickster appears in many forms across many nations, most commonly as Coyote or Raven. Coyote is a figure of vast variability. He creates the world in some stories, brings fire to the people in others, and in still others is outwitted by his own appetites, tricked by animals he thought he was more clever than, left naked and hungry by his own schemes. He is simultaneously revered and ridiculous, sacred and scatological. Raven, especially in the traditions of the Northwest Coast peoples, is the one who steals light from a box at the beginning of the world and releases it into the sky, which is a creation story, and also does it by disguise, by cleverness, by a kind of divine trick, which is a trickster story, both at once. In West African tradition, the Akan people have Anansi, the spider. Anansi is one of the most travelled of all the trickster figures, because when the people of West Africa were forcibly transported to the Americas during the slave trade, they brought Anansi with them, and the spider's stories spread through the Caribbean and into parts of North and South America, taking root and flowering in new soil, adapting to new circumstances, and always carrying the same essential quality: the small, the powerless, the apparently weak, outwitting the large and the strong through intelligence and cunning and irreverence. Anansi is said to have won all the stories in the world from the sky god Niame, who asked an impossible price, and Anansi paid it, which is why, in Akan tradition, stories themselves are called spider stories. The Yoruba people have Eshu, also known as Elegba or Legba, a figure of crossroads and communication who must be propitiated first before any other deity is approached, because without Eshu as the intermediary, nothing passes between the human world and the divine. He is mischievous, he is unpredictable, he is the one who can make the message arrive in a different form than it was sent, which, in a tradition of oral religion, is a serious and sacred function. He carries a pipe and wears a hat that is different colors on different sides, and there are stories of him walking down a road between two farmers' fields, and the two farmers arguing afterward about what color hat they saw, because one saw red and one saw black, and both were right and both were wrong, and Eshu was walking away, satisfied. And in medieval Europe, the trickster appears as Reynard the Fox, the cunning animal protagonist of a cycle of satirical tales that were enormously popular from the 12th century onward, in which Reynard outsmarts the king, the court, the nobles, and the clergy through a combination of lies, flattery, disguise, and brazen self-confidence, and is never quite caught, and never quite redeems himself, and never quite falls either, because the trickster by definition does not stay in one place long enough to be judged. 5 continents: Hermes, Loki, Coyote and Raven, Anansi, Eshu, Reynard. Different languages, different theologies, different cultural contexts. No plausible shared origin. And yet, the same figure. What does this tell us? It tells us, Jung would say, that the trickster is not a cultural invention. He is a psychic necessity. He arises independently wherever humans gather and make meaning together, because he fills a function that nothing else can fill. He is the force that refuses to let any system become entirely rigid. He is the one who laughs at the king, who makes the sacred look for a moment absurd, who reminds the law that every law has an exception, who introduces the unpredictable element that keeps a too orderly world from suffocating in its own rules. He is the chaos without which the cosmos would become a prison. And there is something else Jung noticed, something that connects the trickster to the larger project of the psyche's development. The trickster is often an early figure, a figure from before moral consciousness was fully established, and he embodies the whole range of possibilities without choosing between them. He is not good or evil. He is both and neither. He is the principle of possibility itself, not yet resolved into a direction. And Jung thought that at certain moments in a person's development, this principle needed to become active again, that the trickster within us was what allowed us to break out of a too rigid persona, a too fixed identity, a too constrictive role, and imagine something different. The moment in your own life when you surprised yourself, when you said something unexpected or chose the irregular path or laughed at something you were supposed to take seriously and felt, briefly, more alive than you had felt in weeks. That was not random. That was the trickster doing his necessary work. Let us explore one story about this, a small one, from the Winnebago cycle that Paul Radin collected. In one episode of the Trickster cycle, the trickster, who is called Wakjunkaga in the Winnebago language, which translates roughly as the tricky one, is walking alone and he mistakes his own right hand for an enemy and begins fighting it with his left hand. He fights himself for a long time before he realizes what is happening. He does not learn anything from this, or not in the way that a character in a moral tale would learn something. He simply stops and goes on. On its face, this is a clown story. A figure fighting himself. The audience laughs, but Radin and Jung both pointed to something underneath the comedy. The trickster who fights his own right hand is doing what we all do, most of the time, at a collective level. He is in conflict with himself, not knowing that the opponent is part of him. The enemy is inside. The war is against the shadow, against the anima or animus, against the parts of the self that have been rejected and are now showing up as opponents. The trickster story makes this visible and makes it funny, and making it funny is perhaps the most effective way of making it bearable. The great trickster stories are always also teaching stories, even when they teach through absurdity. They say, in their way, nothing is as simple as you have arranged it. The system has a crack. There is something alive in here that your categories cannot contain. Pay attention to the unexpected thing, because the unexpected thing is sometimes the most important thing. Take a slow breath. Let the trickster settle into his rightful place, which is to say, no particular place, but everywhere and nowhere, grinning at the edges. These four figures, the shadow, the persona, the anima and animus, and the great collective figures, the great mother, the wise old man, the trickster, are the architecture of the ordinary. They are not the figures of unusual people or spiritual specialists. They are the structures of the every human psyche appearing in every culture, every myth, every dream, every family. You have been living inside them since before you had a name for any of this. The woman who shaped you, the elder who surprised you at a threshold, the rule breaker who showed you that the walls had doors, the part of yourself you have not quite been able to look at. All of this has been archetype, has been the deep form showing itself through the local costume, the crystal lattice forcing its shape through the material that happened to be you in this time, in this life. But we are not done yet. There are rooms still ahead, larger ones in some ways. The room of the hero and his journey, which is the room where you will find the strangest connection, the one between a man who spent his life in libraries and a film about a farm boy and a galaxy far away. The room where we will count together the 22 things that happen to every mythic hero from Oedipus to Moses to Arthur, and you will recognize all of them because they have happened in your life too, in different dress, but the same essential shape. And beyond even that, the room where the floods come and the dragons appear, and the scholars from entirely different traditions, none of whom started from the same place, arrive at the same wall and find, astonishingly, the same door. We are moving through the house. We are walking slowly, the way you walk when there is no reason to hurry, when the night is long and the company is good, and every room has something worth pausing in front of. The next figures are waiting, patient, as old things are patient, already knowing that you are coming. Rest here for a moment in the space between the rooms. Let your breathing slow. Let the faces of the figures we have met settle into something like familiarity. The way people at a gathering begin, by the end of the evening, to feel less like strangers and more like the kind of company you would not mind spending a long, dark night with, because they are not strangers truly. You have known them all your life. You are only now, perhaps for the first time, putting names to the faces. And there is something in that, something oddly tender, like recognizing a voice you have been hearing for years and finally finding the person it belongs to, and understanding with a small, quiet start of surprise that the voice was never coming from outside at all. And so we come to the hero. Not the feeling of being heroic, not the daydream of it, not the poster and cape version that lives in theatres and on the walls of children's bedrooms. The deeper structure, the pattern underneath, the skeleton that has been wearing different faces for as long as human beings have had language to dress it in. Because here is something that should stop you if you let it. Not one scholar, not one tradition, not one corner of the world arrived at the hero and called it accidental. They all arrived at the same shape. And the question that should be sitting quietly at the back of your mind right now, the question this whole third room of the house is organized around is, why? Why the same shape? Why again and again, across oceans and centuries and languages that share no common root, does the same figure appear, doing the same things in the same order? There was a man named Lord Raglan. His full name was Fitzroy Richard Somerset, the second Baron Raglan, and in 1936 he published a book called The Hero, A Study in Tradition, Myth and Drama. And in it, he did something wonderfully stubborn and methodical. He made a list, not a vague list, not a poetic, impressionistic list, but a numbered, counted, checkable list of 22 incidents that recur in the lives of mythic heroes. 22, and then he held that list up against the heroes one by one and counted how many incidents each one matched. Let us go slowly with this because it is worth going slowly. The list begins at birth and ends at death or at disappearance or at the mystery of what happened to the hero at the end. And the incidents are these. The hero's mother is a royal virgin. His father is a king and often also a near relative of his mother. The circumstances of his conception are unusual. At birth, an attempt is made to kill him. He is spirited away. He is reared by foster parents in a far country. We are told nothing of his childhood. On reaching manhood, he returns or goes to his future kingdom. He is victorious over a king, a giant, a dragon, or a wild beast. He marries a princess, often the daughter of his predecessor. He becomes king. For a time, he reigns uneventfully. He prescribes laws. Later, he loses favor with the gods or his subjects. He is driven from the throne and city. He meets with a mysterious death, often at the top of a hill. His children, if any, do not succeed him. His body is not buried. He has one or more holy sepulchres, 22 incidents. Now hold that list and hold it steady and let us place Oedipus against it. Oedipus, whose mother was a royal woman and whose father was king of Thebes, whose birth was attended by the prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother, which means that from the very beginning someone wanted him gone. He was left on a hillside to die, feet bound, exposed. He was rescued and raised by foster parents in Corinth, far from Thebes. His childhood is a blank in the myth. On reaching manhood, he travels, encounters the Sphinx, answers her riddle, and with her death becomes king of Thebes. He marries Jocasta, his predecessor's wife. He reigns and prescribes laws. He loses favor catastrophically when the truth comes out. He is driven from Thebes. His death is mysterious and takes place on a hill at Colonus, and his body, according to Sophocles, is taken by the gods in a manner no living person is permitted to witness or describe. Raglan counted. Oedipus scores 21 out of 22. 21. Take a breath here. Let that settle the way something dense settles slowly to the bottom of still water. Now take Moses, the boy whose mother was a woman of the house of Levi, child of a people in servitude under a king. At his birth, Pharaoh commands that all male Hebrew infants be killed. His mother puts him in a basket and sets him on the river. He is found and raised by Pharaoh's daughter, a royal woman in Egypt, far from his own people. His childhood is largely absent from the text. On reaching manhood, he kills an Egyptian, flees, hears the voice at the burning bush, returns to Egypt, confronts Pharaoh, leads his people out. He prescribes laws, the law, the tablets at Sinai, the most famous legislation in human history. He never reaches the promised land. He dies alone on a mountain on the top of Mount Nebo, and no one knows where he is buried. The text of Deuteronomy says so explicitly. No man knows his burial place to this day. Raglan's count for Moses, 20 out of 22. And King Arthur, the son of Uther Pendragon, conceived under extraordinary and unusual circumstances, Merlin's disguise, the deception at Tintagel, an attempt, if not on his life, then on the life of the royal succession. He is taken away and raised by Sir Ector, a foster father, in a place apart from the court. His childhood is largely unnarrated. He draws the sword, he proves himself, he becomes king. He wins victories over kings and giants and forces of darkness. He marries Guinevere, he prescribes laws, the Round Table, the code of chivalry. He loses favor, his kingdom fractures, his queen betrays him. He is driven from Camelot not by armies, but by the slow dissolution of what he built. He dies, or almost dies, at a hill-like place at the last battle, wounded. He is taken to Avalon. His burial is uncertain and disputed. Some say he sleeps and will return. Arthur scores 19 out of 22. 19. And you are beginning to feel it now, perhaps, that quiet, vertiginous feeling that comes when a pattern you thought was coincidence refuses to be coincidence any longer. 21, 20, 19. Oedipus in Thebes, Moses in the desert, Arthur in Britain. 3 figures from 3 entirely different cultural streams, separated by geography and by centuries, scoring between 19 and 21 on a 22-point checklist that one stubborn English scholar drew up in 1936. You could call that a coincidence, people do. But the number of coincidences required to account for it begins to feel at some point like more work than just accepting that something structural is happening. Lord Raglan himself was not a Jungian. He was not particularly interested in the collective unconscious, or in inherited forms, or in the idea that these patterns rise up from some deep, shared layer of the human mind. He was more inclined to think the patterns spread through cultural contact, through story traveling from mouth to ear, from ritual to narrative, from one civilization to another. But even that explanation, which is a real and serious one, leaves a question sitting on the table. Why this shape? Even if the story traveled, why did this particular shape prove so irresistible that every culture that received it, kept it, preserved it, refused to let it change? Why does the hero need to be exposed at birth? Why does he need a foster father in a far country? Why does he need to die mysteriously on a hill with his burial unknown? The traveling story explanation tells you how it might have spread. It does not quite explain why it was worth spreading. Why this and not something else? That question, the why, is where a younger American scholar with a capacious mind and a gift for synthesis enters the room. Joseph Campbell was born in 1904 in White Plains, New York, and he died in 1987 in Honolulu, Hawaii. And in the years between those two dates, he read a very great deal. And he thought carefully about what he read, and in 1949 he published a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. He was 45 years old when it came out. It was not an instant sensation. Books of that kind rarely are. But it moved steadily through the culture, and it moved through the people who made culture, and its movement changed things in ways that are still unfolding. Campbell's central argument was this: underneath the 1,000 different heroes across the 1,000 different cultures and traditions and historical periods, there is one hero, one journey, one structural arc that the human imagination returns to as if drawn by a kind of gravity whenever it tries to tell the story of transformation. He called it the monomyth, a word he borrowed from James Joyce, and he divided it into 3 great movements: separation, initiation, return. The hero begins in the ordinary world. Then something calls. The call may be an event, a messenger, a catastrophe, a longing. Campbell called it simply the call to adventure. And often, in many versions of the story, the hero refuses the call at first. He hesitates. He retreats into the familiar. This refusal, too, is part of the pattern. It is there in the stories because it is there in the experience. We know what the refusal of a genuine call feels like from the inside. Then comes what Campbell named supernatural aid, the arrival of a protective figure who provides the hero with some amulet or knowledge or word needed for the journey. The wise old man we met in the previous room, Merlin at the threshold, the old woman on the road with the gift. This is the same figure, the same function, the same beat in the music. Then the crossing of the threshold, the departure from the known world into the unknown, into what Campbell named the belly of the whale. The descent, the darkness, the moment of greatest danger and greatest transformation, when the old self must dissolve before the new self can emerge. Jonah in the whale, Osiris in the coffin, the shaman's near death and return. The hero does not merely travel to a dangerous place. The hero is in some sense swallowed, digested, changed at the cellular level or what passes for it in story, then the ordeal, then the apotheosis, then the climactic achievement, the seizing of the treasure, the slaying of the dragon, the rescue of the beloved, the winning of the boon, and then the return, which is itself another crossing, another threshold, and often another refusal, because returning is hard. Coming back from transformation and trying to speak of it to people who have not been transformed is one of the fundamental difficulties of the human condition, and the myths encode it faithfully. The boon the hero brings back is, at its deepest level, a gift for the world. The fire Prometheus stole from the gods, the teaching the Buddha carried back from under the Bodhi tree, the laws Moses descended the mountain carrying. The hero goes in as one person and comes back as another, carrying something the world needed and could not have gotten without the journey. Now, let us pause on that for a moment. You have lived this. Perhaps not in a galaxy far away, perhaps not with a sword or a dragon or a supernatural guide who speaks in riddles. But you have had calls you considered refusing. You have crossed thresholds that felt like a kind of death. You have been in your own version of the belly of the whale, some period of your life when everything familiar dissolved and you did not know whether you would come out the other side or what shape you would be in when you did. And if you came out different, and you tried to carry something back. And sometimes the people you returned to did not quite recognize what you were carrying or know what to do with it. Campbell was not writing instructions for screenwriters. He was writing a description of a fundamental human experience, the experience of genuine transformation, and he was showing that human beings across all of recorded history have found, independently, the same story to hold that experience in. Take a slow breath here, let the weight of that settle, and now for the unexpected connection. Because the story of the monomyth did not stay in the library, It walked out of the library in the mid-1970s and sat down across the desk from a young filmmaker who was struggling with a script and could not find the shape of it. The filmmaker was George Lucas. The script was Star Wars. Lucas has spoken about this in many interviews, and the record is clear and direct. He encountered Campbell's work, he read The Hero with 1,000 Faces, and the encounter unlocked something in the material he was working with. He saw the skeleton underneath what he had been trying to build, the farm boy on the desert planet, the call, Leia's holographic message in R2-D2, the old hermit in the desert, the decision to leave Tatooine, the supernatural aid. Obi-Wan Kenobi, the wise old man who gives the decisive gift, the sword that is not a sword but a lightsaber, which amounts to the same thing. The crossing of the threshold into the wider universe, into danger. The belly of the whale, the Death Star, the trash compactor, the literal mechanical darkness that nearly swallows the heroes. The ordeal and the apotheosis, the return with the boon, the destruction of the weapon, the survival of the community, the ceremony and the golden light of the final scene. Campbell and Lucas eventually met. They became friends. In 1988, the journalist Bill Moyers filmed a series of conversations with Campbell at Lucas's own ranch, Skywalker Ranch, in Marin County, California, and those conversations were broadcast as The Power of Myth, a 6-part series, and they introduced Campbell's ideas to an audience far larger than any of his books had reached. There was a touching reciprocity in that. Campbell had helped Lucas find the shape of the story. Lucas then gave Campbell the platform to tell the world why that shape mattered. And then a studio executive named Christopher Vogler, working at Disney in the late 1980s, read Campbell and wrote a 7-page internal memo summarizing the monomyth for the film industry. 7 pages. That memo circulated, spread, became a book called The Writer's Journey, and it has been the underlying structural framework for more films than anyone has properly counted. Every blockbuster you have ever seen that felt like it was pulling at something ancient, that felt like it had a kind of gravity beneath the plot mechanics, was drawing, consciously or not, from the same well Campbell was drawing from when he read the myths. You have been living inside this pattern. Every story that has moved you has been offering you a version of it. And the reason it moves you is not because the story is well crafted, though it may also be well crafted. The reason it moves you is that something inside you recognizes the shape. Something in you has always known this story, because the story is built from the same material you are built from. That is the claim, and it is a large claim, and it deserves more than assertion. So let us talk about the evidence, because the hero is one form of evidence, and Raglan's count is one form of evidence, and the Campbell-Lucas connection is a striking cultural demonstration of something, but a skeptical mind would still want more. And the skeptical mind is exactly the right mind to bring to this room, because the evidence, examined carefully, is genuinely surprising. It does not require faith, it only requires patience and a willingness to look at what is actually there. Let us talk about the flood, not the idea of a flood, the specific story. A world-destroying deluge, a chosen survivor, a vessel, a preservation, a new beginning on the other side of catastrophe. The oldest written version we have is from ancient Mesopotamia, from a civilization that grew up in the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, in what is now Iraq. It is part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is among the oldest narrative literature in human history, written in cuneiform on clay tablets. The flood story within it centers on a man named Utnapishtim, who is warned by a god that the other gods have decided to destroy humanity with a flood. He is told to build a vessel and take aboard the seed of all living things. He does. The flood comes, the world is covered with water. Eventually the waters recede, the vessel comes to rest, and Utnapishtim and his wife are granted immortality and live at the mouth of the rivers apart from humanity. Now travel west to another tradition, another people, another language entirely. The Hebrew Bible, Genesis, a man named Noah who is warned that the earth will be destroyed by a flood. He is told to build an ark and take aboard every kind of living creature. He does. The flood comes. The world is covered with water. Eventually the waters recede. The ark comes to rest on a mountain. A dove is sent out and returns with a branch. And there is a covenant and a new beginning. The Gilgamesh flood story was discovered in the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal in Nineveh in the mid-19th century. And when it was published and translated in the 1870s, it caused a sensation because scholars immediately recognized that the two stories shared not just a general idea, but specific details. The divine warning, the building of the vessel, the sending of birds to test whether land has appeared, the offering of sacrifice when the waters recede. The similarity was not vague, it was structural, but it does not stop there. In ancient Greek tradition, the world was once destroyed by flood, and a man named Deucalion, son of Prometheus, was warned in advance. He built a chest, a large wooden vessel, and when the rains came, he and his wife Pyrrha floated in it for 9 days and 9 nights until the waters receded and the chest came to rest on a mountain, Mount Parnassus or Mount Othrys, depending on the version you are reading. Deucalion and Pyrrha then repopulated the earth, and in ancient Hindu tradition, in a story that appears in the Shatapatha Brahmana and is associated with the god Vishnu in his fish incarnation, Matsya, a man named Manu, is warned of the coming flood by a small fish that asks him to protect it as it grows. The fish grows to an enormous size, reveals itself as an avatar of Vishnu, and instructs Manu to build a great boat. The flood comes. The boat is drawn by the fish through the waters until it comes to rest on a northern mountain, and from Manu descend all the people of the world. 4 traditions: Mesopotamia, Hebrew, Greek, Hindu. Different languages, different gods, different geographies, different times, the same story. And the scholars question, which is the right question to ask, and you should sit with it rather than rush past it, is why. One explanation is diffusion. The stories traveled. Mesopotamia was a hub of ancient civilization and trade and contact, and stories could have moved from Mesopotamian sources into Hebrew tradition through centuries of cultural contact, and perhaps further. This is a legitimate historical argument and deserves to be taken seriously. It may account for some of the similarity, particularly in the Gilgamesh-Noah relationship, where the cultural proximity is real and documented. But the Hindu tradition? The geographic and cultural distance is vast. The timing of its composition raises its own complex questions. And beyond these 4, flood stories appear in traditions across the world, among indigenous peoples of the Americas, in Australian Aboriginal traditions, in the mythology of the Pacific Islands. The diffusion argument becomes harder to sustain when you extend the map that far. Some scholars argue for a geological memory. Massive floods did occur at the end of the last ice age as glaciers melted and sea levels rose, and perhaps the memory of genuine catastrophic flooding was preserved in stories across many cultures. This is also a serious argument. It does not contradict the Jungian reading. The 2 explanations can coexist. The geological event may have created the experience, and the archetype may have shaped the story that preserved the memory of the experience. What is not in serious dispute is the recurrence itself. The pattern is there. It has been there across traditions that had no documented contact with each other. Something in the human story-making instinct reaches for this particular shape when it is trying to tell a certain kind of story. The story of destruction and survival and new beginning, the story of being preserved through catastrophe, the story of starting again on the other side of the end of the world. That is the flood. Now let us talk about the dragon, or rather the combat. The primordial contest between an ordering force and a chaos force usually embodied as a hero god, against a great serpent or monster. Scholars have given this pattern a German name because German scholars identified and named it Chaoskampf, chaos struggle, the battle against the formless dark. In ancient Babylon, the god Marduk fights and defeats Tiamat, the great primordial dragon, the mother of chaos, whose body he then splits apart to make the sky and the earth. The world is literally constructed from the body of the defeated chaos serpent. This is from the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, among the oldest written narratives we have. In the ancient Vedic tradition of India, the storm god Indra fights and defeats Vritra, a great serpent or dragon who has been hoarding the waters, holding them captive, causing drought and death. Indra breaks Vritra open and releases the waters, and life can flow again. This is from the Rig Veda, one of the oldest religious texts in human history. In Norse tradition, Thor, the thunder god, is in a state of eternal enmity with Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent, the world-encircling snake who will, at Ragnarök, emerge from the ocean to fight Thor to the death. Thor will kill Jörmungandr, and Jörmungandr will kill Thor, and that mutual destruction will mark the end of this world and the beginning of the next. In Greek myth, Zeus, before he can establish his order, must defeat Typhon, the last great monster, a creature of cosmic proportions with snakes for legs and 100 dragon heads, the child of Gaia and Tartarus, the embodiment of everything that resists order. Zeus defeats him, buries him under Mount Etna, and the world becomes safe for the civilization of the gods. Marduk and Tiamat, Indra and Vritra, Thor and Jörmungandr, Zeus and Typhon. 4 thunder and sovereignty gods, 4 chaos serpents or monsters, 4 primordial combats at the moment of world creation or world maintenance, 4 traditions with no clear line of direct borrowing running between all of them. And then, in a later key, the same pattern in more human register, Beowulf and Grendel and the dragon, St. George and the dragon, Siegfried and the dragon, Fafnir. The knight in the forest and the serpent in the cave and the maiden who needs rescuing. The shape persists, scales down from the cosmic to the heroic, but the bones are the same. Order against chaos, the hero who stands between the world and the thing that would unmake it. Something in the human mind across thousands of years and across cultures that grew up without contact with each other keeps finding this contest necessary, keeps needing to imagine it, to tell it, to pass it on. The ordering force against the chaos force, the world held in place by the fact of that combat. Why? That is still the question. That is always the question. And here, at this exact point, a scholar appears in the room who is not Carl Jung, who did not start from Jung, who built his understanding from a completely different set of disciplines, and who arrived nonetheless at essentially the same wall. His name was Mircea Eliade. He was born in 1907 in Bucharest, Romania, and he died in 1986 in Chicago, and he was a historian of religions, which means his method was not psychological, but historical and phenomenological. He read primary sources in their original languages. He worked from texts, from ritual descriptions, from the documented practices of actual religious traditions, not from the dreams of patients in a Swiss consulting room. And he arrived at conclusions that sit quietly and without apology beside Jung's, like 2 different travelers who set out from different cities and met at the same crossroads. Eliade's central contribution was the documentation of certain recurring sacred structures across human religious experience. The first is what he called the axis mundi, the cosmic axis, the world center, the pillar or tree or mountain or column of smoke that connects the earth to the heavens above and the underworld below. It appears as the Norse world tree Yggdrasil, whose roots reach into the underworld and whose branches reach into the realm of the gods. It appears as Mount Meru in Hindu and Buddhist cosmology, the cosmic mountain at the center of the universe around which everything turns. It appears in the sacred poles of many indigenous traditions, the central poles of tents and longhouses that represent the cosmic pillar, the place where heaven and earth touch. It appears as the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, understood to be the navel of the world, the point of creation, the spot where earth is closest to heaven. It appears as the tower in the Tower story, the ziggurat reaching toward the divine, the steeple pointing upward. Something in the human religious imagination, Eliade argues, cannot rest without locating a center. A point where the ordinary and the sacred intersect, a place of crossing, a place where you can climb or dig or reach and touch something beyond the ordinary surface of things. This is not metaphor in the way we use that word today as a literary device. For the people who lived these cosmologies, this was a description of how reality was actually organized. The axis mundi was a fact of sacred geography. The world had a center, and the center could be found, and going to the center was different from going to the edge. The second structure Eliade documented across traditions is what he called the eternal return, the mythic time. The time that is not clock time, not linear historical time, but sacred time, the time of origins, the time when the things that matter actually happened. In illo tempore, he wrote, using the Latin phrase, in that time. The time of beginnings, which is also a time that can be re-entered through ritual. When a ritual is performed, Eliade argues, it is not simply a commemoration of something that happened in the past, it is a reenactment that makes the past present again. The shaman does not just remember the first healing. In the healing ritual, the first healing happens again, here, now. The priest does not just remember the sacrifice is performed again, and its original power flows into the present moment through the performance. Sacred time is not sequential, it loops. It can be re-entered, the origin is always available. This is why myths are told not merely as historical records, but as sacred templates. The story of how the world was created is reenacted in ceremony, and through the reenactment, creation happens again, in the small, in the particular, in this village, this season, this child being initiated. The pattern of the origin is the pattern of all subsequent instances of that type of event. The third structure Eliade called hierophany, from the Greek hieros, sacred, and phainein, to show or manifest. A hierophany is a breaking through of the sacred into ordinary space, a place or object or moment that becomes the site where the divine makes itself visible. A tree struck by lightning that becomes a sacred tree. A stone with an unusual shape that becomes a sacred stone. A dream in which something comes that changes the dreamer's life and feels, unmistakably, like a visitation. A place where something happened once, something of overwhelming significance, and the place holds the charge of it long after the event, and people return to it generation after generation because the charge is still there. Eliade was documenting from the outside, from history and anthropology and textual scholarship, something that Jung was documenting from the inside, from clinical psychology and the study of the psyche. Both of them were encountering the same phenomenon: the human mind's insistence on certain structures, the center, the combat, the figure of the wise one, the descent and return, the new beginning after catastrophe. Eliade did not need to posit a collective unconscious to explain what he was finding. He could point to the texts, the rituals, the artifacts, the documented practices. His evidence was external, material, historical. And yet the pattern he was documenting and the pattern Jung was proposing from the interior of the mind were, in their fundamental shape, describing the same thing. Two scholars, different disciplines, different methodologies, different theoretical frameworks, the same wall, the same door. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, one of the more persuasive forms of evidence available when you are trying to understand something as elusive as the deep structure of the human imagination. When independent inquiry from different directions arrives at the same shape, the shape is probably real. You are not looking at one man's theory. You are looking at something that survives the test of being found twice. The axis mundi and the archetype are not the same claim exactly, but they are claims of the same type, that the human mind is not a blank page that different cultures happen to fill with different content, that there are grooves in the page, preformed channels that shape what gets written, the way the axial system of a crystal shapes what the crystal becomes in solution, without itself being the crystal. The word Jung used was form, the empty form, the inherited predisposition, not the image, but the shape that calls the image into being. And Eliade, approaching from outside, from the history of religion and the study of sacred structures across human cultures, is pointing at those same grooves. Look, he is saying, here is the center everywhere, here is the combat everywhere, here is the descent and return everywhere, here is the place where the sacred breaks through everywhere. These are not the same images, they are the same forms in different images. The flood in Mesopotamia and the flood in Greece and the flood in India and the flood in the Pacific Islands are not the same story wearing different costumes. They are different stories that happen to share the same skeleton, and the skeleton is the point. Lie still for a moment. Let the weight of this accumulate without trying to organize it into something neat. It does not need to be neat. The river does not need to be neat. It only needs to keep moving. What we have been doing in this third room of the house is building a case. Not a legal case with evidence meant to convict, but something more like the case you build slowly over a long night by the fire, when the conversation keeps returning to the same inexplicable thing from different angles, and each angle adds something, and by the end of the night, you are not certain you have understood it, but you are certain it is real, the thing you have been circling. You know it is there. You can feel the shape of it, the shape of the hero, the 22 incidents, the separation and the descent and the return with the boon, the flood and the new beginning, the combat and the ordering of the world, the axis at the center, the sacred that breaks through, the mythic time that can always be re-entered. These are not decorative features of human culture. They are structural ones. They are the beams, not the wallpaper. And the question that is opening now, the question this part of the house has been building toward, is the question that will take us into the fourth room. What does this mean for you? Not for the hero in the myth, not for the scholar in the library. For you, lying here in the dark, breathing slowly, carrying whatever it is you carry into the night. Because the argument at its heart is this: these figures and these patterns are not out there. They are not only in the old books, not only in the films, not only in the rituals of distant traditions. They are the architecture of your own mind. The hero's journey is not a narrative technique. It is a description of how transformation actually feels from the inside and why it is structured the way it is. The trickster is not just a character in a myth. He is the part of you that refuses to stay in the box, that makes the joke at the wrong moment, that breaks the rules and survives, that keeps the system honest by refusing to be fully subject to it. The Great Flood is not just a geological memory. It is the story your mind reaches for when it tries to hold the experience of total loss and total beginning. And the hero. The hero is not the person you want to become in the sense of being admired or celebrated. The hero is the part of you that is capable of answering the call, of crossing the threshold, of surviving the belly of the whale and coming back with something that matters. Every person who has ever moved through genuine transformation, and that is eventually everyone, has made the hero's journey in some register, in some key. The myth is not telling you about someone else. The myth is telling you about the structure of your own becoming. Raglan's count, Campbell's monomyth, the flood, the chaos kampf, Eliade's axis mundi, and eternal return and hierophany. These are the documentation. The evidence that the pattern is real and that it is found everywhere, because everywhere is where it lives, in the imagination, in the psyche, in the structure of the mind that generates the story. And the figures we have met, the trickster on 5 continents, the great mother with her double face, the wise old man at the threshold, and now the hero on the journey, are not separate inhabitants of a mythological menagerie. They are functions. They are roles in a drama that the psyche is always staging, because the psyche needs to stage it, because it has always needed to stage it, because something essential about being human requires the telling and retelling of these particular stories in these particular shapes. The river is still moving, the house still has one more room, and the final room is the one where the largest question is waiting. If these figures are the architecture of the mind, what is the whole building for? What is it all in service of? What is the center that the axis mundi is pointing toward? The boon the hero brings back, the wholeness that the pattern is always, in every form and in every tradition, reaching toward. That is what the 4th room holds. We are not there yet. The night is still long enough. There is still time to walk slowly, the way you walk when there is no reason to hurry. There is a figure who appears before the hero ever sets out. Not the wise old man, though he is close in spirit. Not the trickster, though he shares something of the same liminal quality. This one is smaller, more vulnerable, almost unbearably so. It arrives without armor, without experience, without the hardened knowledge that difficulty gives you. It arrives without any of that, and yet something in it is regarded across every tradition that has ever given it a name as containing the most concentrated form of sacred power that any symbol can carry. The divine child. You already know this figure. You have known it longer than you know. The infant in the manger, surrounded by hay and cold air, and the particular silence that is said to fall over the world in that story at the moment of arrival. The infant Horus, floating in the marshes of the Nile Delta, while his mother Isis hides him from his uncle Seth, pressing papyrus reeds around him like a cradle made of the world itself. The baby Krishna in the village of Mathura, born at midnight into danger, smuggled across a flooding river by his father Vasudeva, while the water rose and the rain fell, the infant held above the current. Moses in the bulrushes, a basket sealed with bitumen and pitch set among the reeds at the edge of the Nile, a small vessel carrying something the world will need but cannot yet protect. Every one of these stories turns on the same impossible situation. Something new has arrived, something of enormous future significance, and the world, represented in each story by a threatened power, a Herod, a Seth, a tyrant king, immediately moves to destroy it. The king always hears the news, the king always orders the killing, and the child always, somehow, survives. This is not coincidence. This is the pattern. Lord Raglan, in 1936, included the attempted killing of the infant among his 22 recurring incidents in the lives of mythic heroes. And he was right to, because it is one of the most concentrated expressions of what this archetype is doing psychologically. Think of what the story says beneath the story. Something new is trying to be born, some new potential, some new way of being, some capacity that does not yet exist in the established order. And the established order, which is always in some sense an entrenched power, always resists it, always tries to kill it before it grows large enough to change things. Jung and the classical scholar Carl Gustav co-authored a book in 1949 called Essays on a Science of Mythology, and in it they gave the divine child its fullest treatment. What Gustav noticed across his work in Greek and Roman religion was what Jung had been finding in his clinic for years. This child appears not because any particular culture decided to invent it, but because the psyche generates it. The motif of the miraculous, endangered, future-bearing infant arises spontaneously wherever human beings are grappling with the possibility of transformation, with the sense that something new is trying to emerge from inside a life that has become too old, too rigid, too defended. Think of Oedipus, his father Laius, warned by an oracle that his son will kill him, orders the infant's feet pierced and has him left to die on a hillside. The shepherd who finds him cannot do it. He is passed to another shepherd, then adopted by the king and queen of Corinth, who raise him as their own. The attempt to destroy the divine child fails, as it always fails, because that is part of the pattern. The future cannot be killed even when powerful forces in the present are entirely dedicated to the attempt. Romulus, the founder of Rome, exposed as an infant, along with his twin Remus, suckled by a wolf on the Palatine Hill. Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, whose grandfather Astyages dreamed that from his daughter's body a vine would grow that would cover all of Asia, and who ordered the infant Cyrus killed for that reason, and who failed. The infant protected, the future preserved. What the divine child represents in Jung's reading is not merely a story about a remarkable individual. It represents the archetype of new beginning itself, of the self that is trying to be born out of whatever you are now, of the potential that is always somewhere inside you, more fragile and more powerful than anything you have managed to build so far. It is the part of you that has not yet become what it might become, and it is for precisely that reason always at risk from the parts of you that are invested in remaining exactly as they are. That is the tyrant king, not Herod specifically, not Laius specifically. The psychological tyrant king is the part of the psyche that has organized itself around a particular identity, a particular way of surviving, a particular self-understanding, and that will, with enormous energy and great unconscious determination, work to prevent anything new from displacing it. The divine child survives anyway. It always does in the myth. Whether it always does in the life is another question. That is a question you may have already sat with on a night much like this one. Take a slow breath here. There is no hurry. The story will wait. And now the other half of that pairing, the one who moves through descent and return, who goes down and who comes back, and who is never quite the same for having gone, the core, the maiden. In the Greek tradition, she is Persephone, daughter of Demeter, the earth goddess, gathered with companions in a meadow, bending to pick a narcissus, and then the ground opens. Hades, the lord of the underworld, appears from the crack in the earth and takes her down. And the world above changes immediately. Demeter, her mother, begins to grieve. And as Demeter grieves, the earth grows cold, nothing grows, the grain withers, animals stop bearing young. The world above goes still in the stillness of a grief that has no bottom. This is the myth at the heart of the Eleusinian mysteries, the secret rites held near Athens for roughly 2,000 years, from approximately the 15th century before the Common Era until the 4th century of it. Almost everyone who participated was sworn to silence, and to a remarkable degree the oath was kept. We know the broad shape of what was enacted: the descent, the search, the return. But the specific revelation at the center of the mysteries, the thing that initiates received, was held in confidence across centuries by an extraordinary number of people. What we know is that participants came away transformed, that they describe no longer fearing death, that the myth of Persephone and Demeter enacted in some form in those torchlit rites gave them something that changed how they experienced being alive. Jung and Kerenyi treated the core, the maiden, as the counterpart to the divine child. If the child represents new beginning, pure potential arriving in the world, the core represents that same potential moving into experience, into descent, into what happens when the sheltered young life encounters the underworld, which is to say when any of us encounters loss or darkness, or the parts of existence that cannot be wished away. Persephone goes down. She is in the underworld. She is, at some point, given pomegranate seeds to eat. Some accounts say she ate knowingly, some say she did not. And because she has eaten the food of the dead, she cannot fully return. The compromise that is eventually negotiated is the one that still structures the world in the myth. She returns to the upper world for part of the year, and during that time, Demeter is glad, and the earth is fruitful. And then she must return to Hades, and during those months the earth is bare and cold, the seasons in one story. And in the psychological reading, something closer to what actually happens to a person. Because the pattern the core traces, sheltered, then descended, then partially returned, carrying the mark of where she has been, is not a pattern about someone else. It is the pattern of what it means to come through difficulty, to have been somewhere dark, to have returned not entirely the same, not capable of being entirely the same, but returned nonetheless, and changed in a way that the spring that follows a winter is changed, richer for the contrast, more vivid for the darkness that preceded it. The core is the archetype of that specific movement, of the soul that goes into the underworld and comes back. And what she brings back, what Persephone brings back to the upper world every year in the myth, is not just relief. It is the knowledge of both. The capacity to live in the fruitful world while knowing, fully knowing, what lies beneath it. The Eleusinian initiates who came away no longer fearing death had perhaps received some version of that knowledge. The myth had taken them through the descent and the return through Persephone's journey in a form compressed enough to be experienced in a single rite rather than across an entire life, and they were different for it. There is something worth pausing on even at this hour, even with sleep coming close. Some part of you may know the core's movement from the inside. Some descent you have made, some winter you have lived through, some return that was real but also partial come because you cannot entirely unknow what the underworld showed you. That is not a wound. In the language of the myth, that is initiation. The pomegranate stain stays, and so does the spring. Now, let us go back, all the way back past Jung, past the Burghölzli, past analytical psychology and the 20th century and all of its languages for these things. Let us go back to the word itself, archetype. It is a Greek word, two parts. The first is arch, which means first, or origin, or that from which something comes, and the second is typos, which means imprint, or mark, or model. Put them together and you have archetypon, the original imprint, the first model. The thing that is made before the copies are made, that carries the form which everything else will take its shape from. The word in this sense is very old, older than Jung by a long stretch. It appears in the writings of Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher working in the 1st century of the Common Era, who used it when he was trying to describe the relationship between the divine mind and the created world. The idea that what we see around us is a copy of a more fundamental original that exists at a higher level. The created human mind, in Philo's account, is made in the image of a divine archetype, the original pattern that precedes the pattern you can see. It appears in the writings attributed to Dionysius the Areopagite, a mystical theologian working perhaps in the late 5th or early 6th century, who used it when describing how God is the archetype of which all beauty, all goodness, all order in the world is a dim reflection. The word is doing similar work there by pointing to a source, an original, something that is more real in some sense than the things that derive from it. It appears in the Corpus Hermeticum, the collection of texts attributed to the figure Hermes Trismegistus, 3 times great Hermes, a body of writing that emerged in the early centuries of the Common Era, mixing Greek philosophy with Egyptian religion, circulating around ideas about the nature of the cosmos and the nature of the mind that studies it. The archetype on there is the divine mind's image of the world, and the world itself is the copy that imperfectly incarnates it. Jung knew all of this. He traced the lineage himself in the collected works in the opening paragraphs of what became the central text on this subject. He was not inventing a new concept and giving it a new name. He was taking a very old word that had always pointed toward the idea of an original invisible form that precedes its visible copies, and he was relocating that original, not in the mind of God, not in the Platonic realm of pure ideas, but in the structure of the human psyche itself. The divine archetypes of Philo and Dionysius and the Hermetica come down, in Jung's reframing, and live inside you. The primordial models are not above or beyond, they are below, in the deeper structure of the mind, generating the same images and figures and stories that they have always generated, because the structure that generates them is as old as the human species that carries it. That is the shift. That is what makes Jung's use of the word different from its predecessors, and also what makes it, in a certain light, a continuation of what those predecessors were reaching toward without knowing how to locate. The sacred is not out there. It is in the structure of the thing that reaches toward it. Take a slow breath, feel the weight of the bed, the particular stillness of this hour. None of this needs to be solved tonight. It only needs to be heard. And now we arrive at the question that has been waiting since the beginning. You have been carrying the thread since the first room. You know about the collective unconscious and the personal unconscious. You know about the archetype as such, and the archetypal image, and the invisible form and the local costume it wears. You know about the shadow, the persona, the anima, and the animus, the great mother with her double face, the wise old man at the threshold, the trickster on 5 continents. You know about the hero and the 22 incidents, and the monomyth and the way it moved from Campbell's 1949 book into Lucas's 1977 film, and from there into nearly every story your culture has told itself for half a century. You know about the divine child and the core and the descent and the return. What you have not yet been told, though the whole narration has been oriented toward it since the very first words, is what all of these figures are in service of, what they are pointing at, what the whole system, if you step back and look at the entire map at once, is structured to reach. Jung called it the self. Not the self with a lowercase letter, not the self as you ordinarily mean it. The self that has your name, your history, your face in the mirror, your particular set of memories and fears and preferences. That is the ego. The ego is the center of consciousness. The ego is the part that is reading this, the part that plans and decides and says I and means something by it. The ego is real and important. Jung never dismissed it, but the self, capital S in the way that Jungians write it, to keep it distinct, is something much larger. The self is not the center of consciousness. The self is the center of the entire psyche, conscious and unconscious together. Everything you know and everything you do not know about yourself. everything the ego manages and everything the ego has never seen. The whole thing, all at once, in its totality. Jung said the self is both the center and the totality. Think about that for a moment. Not only the center of a circle, but the circle itself and the center too. The point at the middle of the whole circumference. The organizing principle and the whole that is organized. It is the kind of formulation that sounds abstract until you let it settle, and then it begins to feel like the most precise description of something you have always vaguely known but never had a word for. He also said something that surprised many of his readers and delighted others. He called the self the God within us. Not in a metaphorical or dismissive way. He was not saying the God who appears in religions is nothing more than a projection of this inner structure, as Freud might have said. He was saying something more careful and more interesting, that the experiences human beings have had of the divine, the encounters with something overwhelming, something that is both within and beyond, something that produces what the scholar Rudolf Otto called the numinous, the sense of tremendous mystery and also tremendous fascination. Those experiences arise at least partly from contact with the self, from the collision between the limited ego and the much larger whole of which it is a part. The ego meeting the self is, in psychological terms, something like what the mystics across every tradition describe as the encounter with the sacred, the feeling of being held by something larger than yourself, the sense of a presence that is both deeply interior and utterly transcendent, the groundlessness and the ground at once. Jung was not reducing religion to psychology. He was saying psychology had discovered, in its own language, something that religion had always been pointing at in its language: different maps, the same territory. And the evidence for the self's existence in the clinical work came in a form that was almost impossible to anticipate. Mandalas. The word is Sanskrit. Mandala means circle. In the traditions of Hinduism and Tibetan Buddhism, mandalas are elaborate geometric diagrams. A circle containing a square divided into 4 quadrants, with a center point, sometimes with deities arranged around that center, sometimes with complex symbolic imagery filling every section. They are used in meditation and ritual and visualization. They are extraordinarily ancient, and they are highly specific to those traditions. A person who had never encountered Tibetan Buddhism or Hindu iconography would have no obvious reason to produce anything resembling them. And yet, Jung reported that patients in the clinic, patients who had no knowledge of Eastern religious art, no exposure to these traditions, began spontaneously drawing images in this form. A circle, a square within the circle, or a cross within the circle, dividing it into 4. A center, a sense of order around the center, radiating outward, not always elaborate, often quite simple, but structurally aligned with something the patient had no reason to know existed. Jung himself began drawing mandalas every morning during a period of what he called inner uncertainty, roughly the years following his break with Freud, when he was descending into his own psychological depths, when he was, in some sense, on the cause journey himself. He drew them and felt that they expressed where he was, psychologically, each day. And only much later, when he encountered the Sanskrit texts and the Tibetan art, and the tradition behind them, did he realize what he had been doing. The mandala, in his understanding, is the spontaneous symbol of the self. When the psyche is moving toward integration, when the process of individuation is underway, when the ego is beginning to come into right relationship with the larger whole, the psyche begins to generate this image: a circle, a center, a quaternity, 4 parts around the center, because 4 seems to be the structure the psyche reaches for when it is trying to represent wholeness. Think of the four directions, the four seasons, the four elements that ancient Western philosophy and ancient Chinese philosophy both independently settled on. The four psychological functions Jung identified: thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition. Something in the mind keeps arriving at four when it is trying to hold the whole. The mandala is not a picture of the self. No picture could be. The self is the archetype as such, the form that underlies the images, the invisible axial lattice around which the crystal takes its shape. But the mandala is the archetypal image that the self most naturally generates when the psyche is, in some deep way, healthy, when it is moving in the right direction, when the center is being approached. And then there is individuation, the word Jung used for the life's work. It comes from the same root as individual, but and from the Latin individuum, meaning that which cannot be further divided, the indivisible, the integrated, undivided whole. Individuation is the process of becoming that, of becoming, over the course of a life, the particular whole that you specifically are. Not in general, not as an instance of a type, as this unique, specific, irreducible self with its specific shadow that has never existed before and its specific anima or animus, its specific relationship to every one of the archetypes that has played out in the specific theatre of this specific life. Jung described it in the 7th volume of the collected works, the 2 essays on analytical psychology, and he was clear that this is not a project for the first half of life. The first half of life has different work. The first half of life is occupied with building the ego, establishing identity, finding a place in the social world, constructing the persona that can navigate that world, acquiring the skills and relationships and structures that allow a person to function. That is necessary work. The ego must be built before it can be in any meaningful sense transcended. It is in the second half of life, in roughly from midlife onward, though the timing is not rigid and the outer event is less important than the inner one, that individuation properly begins. This is often marked by a crisis of some kind, something that the first half of life structures cannot contain. The sudden sense that what you have been doing is not enough or not right or not the whole of what you are. The discovery that the persona has been worn so long it has begun to feel like a face, and that there is terror in considering what might be underneath. The midlife crisis, in its more serious form, is not vanity or regression. It is, in Jungian terms, the psyche's signal that the second half has arrived, that the shadow, which has been conveniently ignored or projected outward for 40 years, now needs to be faced, that the anima or animus, which has been animating projections onto other people rather than being integrated into conscious life, now needs to be engaged directly, that the archetypes that have been running the show from below need to be, if not controlled, they cannot be controlled, then at least acknowledged, met, entered into a relationship with. The shadow first. Always the shadow first, because the shadow is the nearest. It is the closest to consciousness, even though by definition it is outside it. It is the part of you that is most clearly yours, your specific rejected qualities, your particular disavowed capacities, the traits you cannot stand in others because they remind you of what you will not see in yourself. Integrating the shadow does not mean acting out everything you have suppressed. It means acknowledging that these qualities exist in you, ceasing to project them exclusively outward, becoming, in the precise sense of the word, more honest, more whole. And then the anima or animus, the inner feminine in a man, the inner masculine in a woman. Though Jung knew and his successors have continued to develop the understanding that these are not rigid categories but functional ones, describing a relationship between the dominant conscious orientation and the compensatory opposite that the unconscious carries. The anima and animus are the mediators. They are the figures who, when encountered in dreams or in projection, are trying to carry something from the unconscious toward the ego. The challenge is to receive what they carry rather than simply projecting it. And then gradually, across years that may span decades and that are never finished in a lifetime, the meeting with the deeper archetypes, the Great Mother, the wise old man, the self itself, approached asymptotically, never reached entirely, but approached. The center that the mandala points toward, the totality that the whole process is serving. Jung was careful not to describe individuation as a goal that can be achieved, checked off, completed. It is not an examination you pass. It is more like the journey the hero takes, not the arrival at the destination, but the becoming that happens along the way. The boon the hero brings back in Campbell's schema is not a thing, it is a transformation, a quality of consciousness, a capacity for wholeness that the journey itself, with all its dangers and thresholds and descents and returns, has produced. You cannot download individuation. You cannot read it and acquire it. The self does not respond to intellectual understanding the way the ego does. It requires, in Jung's language, encounter. It requires being willing to meet what is in you, including what is dark, including what is frightening, including the shadow and the figures the shadow contains, and the knowledge that you are larger and stranger than you have been willing to believe. That is the whole building. That is what all the figures are in service of. The shadow teaches you what you will not see. The persona teaches you what you have been hiding behind. The anima and animus teach you what the opposite in you is carrying that you have not yet claimed. The trickster disrupts you when you have become too certain, too fixed, too identified with a single position. The Great Mother teaches you that nourishing and devouring are not opposites, but the same force at different moments. The wise old man appears at the threshold when you are about to cross into something you cannot cross alone. The hero teaches you that the monster is real, but so is the capacity to face it. The divine child teaches you that something new is always trying to be born in you, regardless of what you have been doing for the last 40 years. The core teaches you that the underworld has to be visited, and that descent is not destruction, and that you will come back from it carrying something that cannot be acquired any other way. And the self, the center, and the totality, the mandala point, the God within, the whole, that all of these figures are aspects of the self, is what all of it, every figure and every drama and every dream and every story that has ever been told about any of these figures in any tradition on any continent, is always trying to approach. Now here is a thing worth saying slowly in the particular quiet of this hour. You have been meeting these figures your whole life. They have been showing up in your dreams, the figures that frighten or attract or puzzle you, the ones that seem to have an authority no actual person in your waking life has. They have been showing up in the stories that affected you beyond what the stories seem to warrant. The book you read at 20 that you still think about. The film that did something to you that you cannot quite explain. The myth or the fairy tale that seemed, when you first encountered it, to already know something about you. They have been showing up in the people you have overreacted to, either with intense attraction or with disproportionate hostility, because that intensity is a signal, in Jungian terms, that a projection is underway, that an archetypal figure is being seen in the face of an actual person. The wise old man has appeared to you probably more than once, not always in an elderly person, sometimes in a book, sometimes in a moment of apparent coincidence that gave you exactly the piece of information you needed at exactly the moment you needed it, sometimes in a dream figure who said something that you remembered when you woke, that you keep. The trickster has visited you. in the plan that fell apart at the last moment and revealed something better, in the relationship that did not go the way you expected and left you somewhere you needed to be, in the humiliation that later turned out to have freed you from something you had been carrying too long. The Great Mother has held you and has, at times, threatened to swallow you, in people and in institutions and in the pull towards safety that can become, if you are not paying attention, a refusal to grow. The shadow walks behind you. It has always walked behind you. And the things that make you most uncomfortable about other people, the quickest to anger, the most defensive, the most contemptuous, those are usually the places where the shadow is most active, most insistent, most waiting to be recognized. This is not diagnosis. This is not psychology. As a problem-finding exercise, this is the description of what it is to be fully human. The archetypes are not pathologies. They are the furniture of the house. You did not choose them any more than you chose the language your brain acquired before you were old enough to make choices. They are older than you. They are older than any particular culture. They are the inherited form, the empty axial lattice that was waiting for your life to pour itself into it and take a shape. The shape it takes is you, the unique, specific, never before seen and never again configuration that is the result of these ancient inherited forms meeting your particular life, your particular encounters, your particular version of every threshold and descent and return that the pattern has always moved through. That is what the word meant all the way back at the beginning, archetypon, the original imprint. Not the copy, but the form that makes the copies possible. And what you are, the particular configuration that is your life, is the copy that no one made before and no one will make again. The original imprint manifesting in a form that is entirely your own. Philo of Alexandria was reaching toward this. Dionysius the Areopagite was reaching toward this. The authors of the Corpus Hermeticum were reaching toward this. The builders of the Eleusinian mysteries, holding their silence across 2,000 years, were protecting something like this. And Jung, working in a clinic in Zurich in the early 20th century, looking at his patients and at the Mithraic papyrus and at the mandalas drawn by people who had never seen a mandala, was finding it again in the language that his century had available to him. The language changes, the pattern does not. The divine child is always trying to be born. The core is always descending and returning. The trickster is always disrupting the system that has gotten too sure of itself. The wise old man is always standing at the threshold. The great mother is always both feeding and devouring. The hero is always on the way out and on the way back. And the self is always at the center. Always the center and the totality at once. Always the place the whole journey is oriented toward. Always the wholeness that is being reached for. Even when you didn't know it was being reached for. Even when it felt like something else entirely. This is what the myths were carrying. Across the flood myths and the dragon-slaying stories, and the exposed infants on hillsides and the goddesses descending into the earth, and the tricksters stealing fire or shape-shifting into foxes, they were carrying the map of the psyche. The description of what it feels like to be a mind moving through a life, encountering its own depths, struggling with its own darkness, returning from its own descents, and always reaching toward the wholeness that is already there at the center that has always been there. That is the center and the totality of what you are. You have been living inside this story. You have been one of the characters in it. And everything the story has ever been trying to tell you in every language and on every continent and in every century is something you already know, not as information, as something older than information, as the shape of the thing you are. the axial system that was there before the crystal formed, the imprint that came first, the form inside which your life, in its particular and irreplaceable way, has been taking its shape all along. That is enough now. That is more than enough for one night. We have walked a long way through the crystal lattice and the Burghölzli and the solar phallus man and the Mithraic papyrus, through the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious, through the archetype as such and the archetypal image, through the shadow that walks behind every person and the persona that walks in front, through the anima and the animus and the great mother who nourishes and devours and the wise old man who appears at the threshold, through the trickster on 5 continents, Hermes and Loki and Coyote and Anansi and Eshu, and through the hero with his 22 incidents and his monomyth and his journey from Oedipus to Moses to a long time ago in a galaxy far away, through the flood that Utnapishtim survived and Noah and Deucalion and Manu and the dragon that Marduk defeated and Indra and Thor and Zeus, through Eliade and his axis mundi and his eternal return and his hierophany, his word for the moment when the sacred breaks through the ordinary, through the divine child in the bulrushes and in the manger and in the marsh and in the river crossing, through the core descending into the underworld and returning with the mark of it on her, spring after winter, fruitful after bare, through the ancient word itself, archetypon, first imprint, carried by Philo and Dionysius and the Hermetica across centuries before it arrived at a clinical office in Zurich and was given back to the inside of the mind where it had always belonged. Through individuation, the lifelong work, the second half of life, the shadow faced, the anima met, the self approached, the mandala drawn by hands who did not know why they were drawing it, drawn spontaneously because the psyche knows what it is reaching toward even when the mind that carries the psyche does not. The God within, the center and the totality, the whole building that all the figures serve. Let all of that settle now the way things settle when you stop carrying them and simply set them down. They do not need to be understood tonight, they only need to have been heard. And if one image stays, the crystal and the invisible lattice, the trickster appearing in 5 different places at once, the infant in the basket floating among the reeds, the mandala drawn by a hand that did not know it knew. If one image stays, that is enough. You don't need to hold all of it. You don't need to remember any particular name or date or argument. The figures already live in you. They lived in you before tonight. They will go on living in you after sleep takes you. That is what makes them archetypes. Not that they were given to you, but that they were already there. The river has reached the sea now. The house has no more rooms. And whatever wholeness is possible for a human being, the kind that is not a final destination, but a direction, not a state you achieve, but an orientation you choose again and again across the whole length of a life, that wholeness is already underway in you. It has been underway longer than you know. Enough stories for one night. Off to sleep now, Grandpa says.